Hey everyone, Evan Transu here, lead practitioner and co founder at Bucks County Light Therapy and Functional Medicine Center, where we are putting the fun in functional medicine. Now, today, what we're talking about is something admittedly not so fun. It is my very poor hormone results from when I originally first started testing, because I was already in the natural medicine and functional health space for a few years before this. I just really did not have access to consistent lab testing. And then I became a practitioner myself, and the rest is history. I've been using labs all the time for the last 6 years. I really love these as tools to help one motivate people to actually do the lifestyle stuff that they need to do, but also validate clients and just show them exactly why they feel the way that they feel. And so today, there is, I guess, one fun part to this. We're going to show how you can actually heal these hormones over time. Proof that this works, proof that it can happen to you, because it's exactly what happened to me. What we're looking at in this first test, and I used two different labs for this just because stuff got a little outdated, but the technology overall is the same, at least for what I'm showing you in this part. What we're looking at here is something called a cortisol diurnal rhythm. The reason that we measure cortisol diurnal rhythms and we do it through saliva, these are four salivary samples. So when you see the four little markers, that is representing a different saliva sample that the person would have given, in this case, myself, at the particular time. The reason we're using saliva is because when you do that with cortisol, it is actually one of the most accurate ways to test someone's circadian rhythm. It's not the only way, but it's a really accurate way to see how their circadian rhythm is doing. Now, let's say you have never done anything like this. You don't even know what a lab test is, never heard of it. You come from a tribe where lab tests do not exist. Let's try to use some common sense here. If this is the upper end of the reference range, the little X's there, and then the diamonds are the lower end of that reference range, and I tell you, you want to be in between those, and then you look at mine, which are the solid circles, how do you think I'm doing? Well, the morning looks okay. And it's a key point here because if you had only tested me one time in the morning, you would actually say my cortisol output is what? Normal. Everything looks fine. The lab work looks good. Maybe you've heard this if you've been someone suffering with chronic health issues for a while. The lab work looks normal. Everything looks okay. We couldn't find anything. We know you don't feel good, but we couldn't find anything on the labs. If only the morning marker had been tested, that's exactly what would have been said to me. It was perfectly within range, 13.0 to 24.0 on the right there is the reference range, and I was a 19.7. Perfect. But what we see when we actually test it as a pattern is I plummet by noon, like way below the reference range by noon. And then at afternoon, I'm the same number. It was a 1.5 both times from noon to afternoon, which is actually an issue in and of itself. And I'll explain that in a moment. And then the nighttime one was lower than it should have been as well. Or excuse me, that's up here. So it was a 0.34 and I needed to be at a 1.23. Now, what this means from a general perspective, because today we're not going to totally go in depth with this particular lab, but what this means in general is that my body was under chronic stress for a while. This doesn't happen overnight. This is what we would call the exhaustive phase of HPA-Axis dysfunction, and that's in the next slide. But the exhaustive phase implies that the person has been dealing with stress for a while. This isn't a day or a week or even a month. It is probably years that has occurred before this person got to this place, and that is certainly true for myself. Now, one thing I have to tell you on this test today, because I just think it's cool to show you how we think about these things as functional practitioners and the unique clues we might find. When we look at the noon to afternoon, obviously both are low. They're out of the reference range, they're below the reference range, and they're the same number. So even if you are testing this from a functional range, you say, oh, well, it's just low, right? There's no big deal here. This is actually what we call a relative elevation from noon to afternoon in this case. Now, what might that mean? Let's just use the words there, relative and elevation. Well, we have something elevating, but the numbers are the same. But then we have the word relative. When we're looking at relative elevations, what we're seeing here is that the general trend for someone's cortisol pattern should be high in the morning. It trends much lower by noon, right? That's probably the biggest jump overall when you look at even the upper end and the lower end here. So the biggest jump is from morning to noon, but there is a jump down again from noon to afternoon as well. It's not nothing, it does decrease. And you could see that in the reference ranges over here. Noon should be a 5.0 to an 8.0 on this test, and afternoon should be a 4 to 7. When we see that two people or a person has the same two numbers here, What that would be then is a relative elevation. It means that based on a normal cortisol diurnal rhythm, I should be lower than 1.5 come afternoon because it was already low at noon. Does that make sense? And so, yes, it's low generally speaking, but it should have been even lower because it should always be lower than the noon number. That's what could be assumed. Now, this is not a significant relative elevation. So, depending on the client, I wouldn't even necessarily look at this as a major clue. And admittedly, I can't even remember back specifically to that time to what my practitioner and myself would have concluded this might have indicated. But a relative elevation, when we're looking at this test, is something where we know there was a stressor occurring in the person's life or in the person's body. This could be a food that they're sensitive to. This could be activities that they were doing at the time. Maybe they were going on a walk at noon, but maybe they were on a work conference where they had to present at afternoon, right? Maybe they had a fight with someone that they loved. And again, these numbers did not jump enough to warrant really any of that, but something changed in my body that was leading to that relative elevation. And so we'll start investigating with the person that we're working with to figure out what was going on there. What did happen and why did this go up? And is it another clue that we can use for further testing or further protocol development for you? Or is it just something that, hey, doesn't really happen every day? You don't really have to present for work every single day. You're totally good to go. Just things to think about. Now, on the next slide here, what we're seeing, and I actually have a little bit more of my results after that, but on the next slide, what we're seeing is the phases of HPA axis dysfunction. And what we can see here is there are four phases. One looks a little scary towards the end, right? It's a bit dramatic. We have the skull and crossbones, but in theory, that is technically what would happen towards the end of that phase. But what I meant when I said, but by the time someone gets into this exhaustion phase, which is this red one down here, there has been some stress going on for a while. Here's how it typically goes. HPA axis dysfunction, by the way, stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction. This would be the fancier and technically more correct way of describing what has previously been referred to as adrenal fatigue. If you've never heard that, you can keep it out of your vocabulary. And if you have heard that before, just know HPA axis dysfunction would be a more accurate way of describing what is actually happening in someone's body when they have quote unquote adrenal fatigue. The first stage here is adaptation. And this is homeostasis. This is normal. This means that basically on a daily basis, I am able to handle the stress that gets thrown my way. Maybe I have a tough job and I work out, so that puts some stress on the body, but I get 8 hours of sleep and it's really good sleep. I go to bed on time. I'm blocking blue light at night. I eat well. I have great relationships in my life. I'm able to handle the stress that gets thrown at me. So I'm all good. That's not where most people are, right? You don't need to know anything about this stuff to know that how true that is. A next phase, or the next phase, is the acute distress phase. Now, this is really a tough one because people rarely will get help in this case. I have almost tested no one, at least in the earlier stages of their testing, where the acute phase was present for them ever because they feel wired and tired. They feel like they can handle this. This would be, if you have experienced college days, this would be the person who is drinking every single night of the week at college, sleeping 4 hours, going to work the next day, cramming for exams, and yet somehow they're managing to do it. I'm not saying you feel good or optimal when you're doing that, but you're doing it all right. You're making it. You don't have a chronic disease. You're not dying. You have to be in the acute distress phase because what's happening is there's a lot of stress going on, but you're kind of able to push out more than you should. The issue is if you hang out here too long, because you see how it kind of curves up, and so this works for a little bit. The body is pretty strong. The body is meant to adapt to stress. So we can handle this for some time. But if you're going to allow yourself to get into this at all, chances are you're probably willing to let it stay there for a while because of the lifestyle that you're living. And then eventually the body can't keep up anymore. And we start dipping down. And then we end up in what we call the compensatory phase. This is the orange one here. The compensatory phase is kind of tricky because if you look at this, isn't this in similar range to the adaptation phase? And adaptation is totally normal. And this is where you need a practitioner who is keen to this stuff for them to actually be able to interpret your lab results properly. The lab results of someone in the compensatory phase For example, this right here, they might all, in theory, be within the quote unquote reference range. Everything might be fine. What we are going to see, though, is an overall trending low cortisol sum. And what I would expect to see in that type of person is, even if you had something like this high, maybe my graph would look a lot, the rest of the graph at least, would look closer to these diamonds. And it would kind of hang out right here. And there might be relative elevations. It might look a little funky. This would be indicative, and there'd be some stuff going on with DHEA as well. There would be an indication here that perhaps, okay, maybe I'm in that compensatory phase. The other biggest sign of this, and this is plain and simple, this person is symptomatic or in a disease state. This person is going to be symptomatic or in a disease state, a state of disease. That's why they're in the compensatory phase. They've been going for a while, can't keep up anymore. So now they're feeling that stress. Cortisol is anti inflammatory. Cortisol is anti-pain. It tries to help you deal with this stuff. So when you still have a amount of stress in your life, but you can't keep up with it anymore, now you're going to feel it. Now you're going to get the symptoms, and you're possibly going to end up with a disease, a diagnosis even, and the labs will look normal for a very short period of time. Quote unquote normal, but trending low. After that, you can't last in this very long. I've ran some in the compensatory phase. It's actually kind of, I wouldn't say it's rare, but it's not as common as one would think. We end up in the exhaustive phase. And this is where people are just not doing well, man. They almost certainly have some type of diagnosis at this point. They feel like hell, and they've been to 7 different people, unfortunately, before they end up finding someone like us. This is where I was at when I got those labs back. And let's do a little quiz here. What part, if we could somehow quantify, like let's say the exhaustive phase here, we'll call this like the first fourth, second fourth, third fourth, and then the end phase, the fourth fourth. And I'm here, so it can't be that one. I'll give you a hint. Based on my labs, where do you think I was at total? If the cortisol sum's 23 for myself and the reference range is 23 to 42, and my morning, made the cut, it was actually even a little on the higher end. And then my noon and afternoon and nighttime are the ones that were tanked. Where do you think I'd fall on that exhaustive phase? If you guessed in that first fourth, you'd be correct. I was basically right here. I was coming off of that compensatory phase, and I was sitting right around here, which is okay because you can come back from this, and the proof is going to be in the lab tests that I show you in a second, which is awesome. But there are people out there dealing with this. A lot of people test this way. We're working with people in their early 20s who are testing in the exhaustive phase. Absolutely crazy. Real quick, I just wanted to show you some of the other things that we found on that test that I ran originally. This one's nuts. My progesterone level was a 433.3. Now, the upper end, the highest end for the male reference range, because it's a mostly female hormone, is 100. I was 4.3 times higher than the upper end of the reference range. It was a very admittedly embarrassing conversation that I had with my practitioner at the time because, as well versed as he was, he couldn't figure this one out. And his only question to me, because I was about 21 years old when I ran this originally, and this was exactly what you want your practitioner to be telling you or asking you. He said, "Do you have, a woman in your life?" And at the time I didn't. I said, "No." He's like, "Okay, okay, no worries. But are you maybe seeing a woman who's a little bit older?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm definitely not doing that, right?" And then he explained to me the reason he was asking this is because older women sometimes, or middle-aged women, will use progesterone creams topically. And his best guess here, because he couldn't even figure this out, was thinking that perhaps they put it on topically and they are quote unquote seeing me, and now I'm getting the progesterone into my system. That would have actually been, I guess, a half decent answer or solution in this case, but that was not the case, unfortunately. So we never fully figured this one out. I will just say, when I ran the test again after doing the protocols and everything, it was perfectly within range. That was absolutely awesome. The other notable thing here, too, is the melatonin. We can see that it's a 12.0 to 35.0 for both male and female. And I was at a 12.9. I wasn't doing so well, even though I was trying to make sure I got to sleep on time. And here are my tests when I retested. Now, even this was from several years back, so I would love to get this tested again soon and see where it is. And we noticed something going really well here. This is my same, well, it's the same person, right? It's not the same lab, but it's my same body, and yet it's operating completely differently. We see a 2.42 in the morning, and we could almost look at this as a non-clue or thing not to worry about because you can see the yellow is just where we start to get a little bit hesitant. And if we go back to my original labs, even when I was in that exhaustive phase, for whatever reason, it just seems that Evan Transu happens to trend a little bit high. So I'm not going to look at that one as a big deal. My noon, perfectly within the green as we'd expect, actually a little bit higher too. Remember? Because it's almost closer to that yellow as it should be. That makes sense. If it was closer to the bottom yellow, I'd say, well, that's really plummeting. But since I was in the yellow in the morning, this makes sense for noon. We can see that I had a healthy change from noon to evening. I'm still within the green and I'm a little bit less than I was at noon. That's awesome. And at night, I'm actually, I think, no, that's perfect there. It was literally perfect. Maybe a little bit on the lower side, but overall perfect and within the green. And I think I was very relaxed when I was doing this. So that could be why. So you can heal, guys. There are protocols for this stuff. It's different for everyone how you heal. Your stressors in your life might be completely unique. The things that show up on the labs that are really affecting your body could be completely unique. And in fact, they will be. But you give it enough time, you let the body does what it needs to do or do what it needs to do, does what it needs to do. You can heal. This is the same mechanism by which when you get a paper cut, your finger heals. You don't have to tell it to do anything. You didn't have to go to the doctor. You didn't have to command it, hey, finger, you better heal or else. You just stopped picking the scab. You stopped bugging it. Maybe you used less paper with sharp edges and you continued on with your life. And the body has an innate healing ability that is not hippie science. That's not woo woo. It is proven to you every single time that you have gotten better from anything broken bone, paper cut, whatever. The same mechanism works in these other areas of the body. The problem is the stressors are bigger and less obvious. So you need to use a system, possibly with labs, hopefully with labs, that figures out what's going on in the body so we can remove the stressors and let the body does what it needs to do. It is the best of Western and Eastern medicine. I hope that makes sense. If you guys want to learn more about us, you can visit us at buckscountylighttherapy.com, and we'll see you in the next video.